So our body is primarily composed of protein and fat and cholesterol. So for example, our bones is collagen, that's a protein. There's a large mineral store within the bones. Calcium helps solidify that collagen structure, which is basically our frame. The brain is 60% fat, 20% cholesterol. All of our organs are proteins, all of, among other things. Our cells all have a lipid membrane, so a fat layer all around them. Our nervous system is primarily a fat sheath that's around our whole nervous system that kind of insulates it and allows the conduction the action potential to fire and to propagate down the nerve, so that, for example, the nerve endings for muscles, we can contract our muscles, for example. So we're mostly protein and fat. That's the whole point that I'm trying to get to. So it just makes sense that if we're going to have a diet, that the majority of our food intake should be protein and fat, so that we can replace the actual structure of our body. Now, carbohydrates do not form any structure in our body. It's strictly a fuel source that we take in, that goes into our cell, that goes into the mitochondria within our cell. That's where the energy is produced in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So to say to a large population that 60% of our calories should be carbohydrates doesn't make any sense, because carbohydrates is strictly a fuel, and if you wish to use carbohydrates as a fuel in the form of glucose, then it's smart that you titrate it to your activity level. Understanding that when we are ingesting carbohydrates, the glucose molecule, once it enters the bloodstream, can be used immediately for generating ATP for that cell. It can also be stored in our liver and our muscles. When glucose is stored in our liver and muscle in its storage form, it's called glycogen, which is a glucose molecule and water. So when sugar is stored inside of our body, it is in the form of glycogen. So that's why when we carb up, if we were empty in our reserves, we put on about like 5, possibly up to 10 pounds of water if they were completely diminished. For example, when you do a low carbohydrate diet, there's a lot of weight loss that happens really quickly initially. And again, that's just depleting that reservoir. So there is a large weight fluctuation that's caused by water. But another alternative to using carbohydrates, because carbohydrates do have a strong insulin response, and insulin is a fat storage hormone. So we have to keep that in mind also. We can also use fat though, because fat is a backup fuel. So when carbohydrates are not being supplied to the body, not only does fat take part in hormones, in the layering of our cells, in the insulating of our bodies, it makes 60% of our brain. So not only is it structural, but it's also an energy source. Now, the energy source that we get from fat is fatty acids. And fatty acids also go to the liver and they get converted into ketones. So ketones is kind of like the fat version of glucose, right? So carbohydrates, energy is glucose, fat, energy is ketones. All right, so ketones, the body runs excellent with them. So that's the point I'm trying to make, is that carbohydrates are not essential, all right? They are a source of fuel that can be used. It's a little bit more tricky, because if you carbed up and you replenished all of your glycogen stores the day before and you were sedentary after and you're sedentary today, adding another 60% of all that you're going to eat that day in carbohydrates is ridiculous. You don't need it. So when you're doing carbs, you have to keep in account the activity level, the energy demand that you're doing, and also whether your reservoirs are full or empty. When you are supplying yourself in a diet that is very low in carbohydrates and you wish to use primarily fat as a fuel, then when you're supplying the nutritional fat, it's going to get turned into ketones to supply your body. The fat that's not needed for energy at the moment also goes just to replenish your brain and the structures and all of your cells. So fat usually doesn't get wasted. It's a very useful fuel. The problem is that if you're consuming a lot of carbohydrates and your body's going to use those first, then the difference is that if you do add even the healthy fats, well, it'll be used for what's essential for your body structure, but any additional will get stored as fat. So fat can be fattening when you're using a high carbohydrate diet. But when you're restricting the carbohydrates and wishing to strictly, primarily use fat and protein, then it's a different story. So that is why I suggest that the majority of your macronutrients should be fat and protein to rebuild your body, and the added benefit that fat is also an energy source that can be used as a primary energy source. That's pretty much all I wanted to talk about, just to make sense that I find that the recommendations that they're giving to the public about 60% carbohydrates daily as your out of all your food, 60% should be energy. I think that is not fine-tuning, it's not individualizing eating or teaching people that to understand what exactly the chemistry behind it is. People understood exactly the purpose of carbohydrates, that it's strictly energy, I think that they would be a lot more able to use carbohydrates in a beneficial way. Understanding that they would limit their carbohydrates if they knew that they stocked up the meals before. If they're sedentary that day, they don't need carbohydrates. Fat and protein have essential amino acids and essential fats. When we say essential, it means that our body cannot produce it. We have to get it from our diet. Carbohydrates are not essential. We've never heard of a carbohydrate, an essential carbohydrate. That's because protein, the amino acids, and the glycerol off the fat can produce glucose. So glucose isn't essential, even though it's needed for a few small pathways that ketones can't help with. As long as you're supplying the protein and fat, you are producing glucose. That's why my blood sugar, when I was fasting, was still 4.9, even if I wasn't ingesting anything, because the fat that was on my body was getting turned into glucose. During a fasting state, the body is in a catabolic process, and it's eating and recycling all the broken proteins, so it's also able to make glucose with that. So that's my opinion about why the macros do not make sense. The recommendations are not helpful, they're inaccurate, and that's my opinion on the matter. All right, thanks guys.